Early last year, we were blessed with the launch of Dead Space Remake, which many would argue is one of the best remakes ever made. It captured the original just so perfectly, honored the source material while modernizing and improving on what needed to be improved, making it what many would consider to be the ultimate version of Dead Space. And the critical acclaim was just, all over the news, and it is something that many people thought would pave the road to Dead Space becoming just a more normalized IP, being something that EA would really lean into the future. But based on recent news, it looks like Dead Space is back on ice. So this news began to circulate when Jeff Grubb took the giant bomb to share that he heard from sources that EA Motive was working on a Dead Space 2 remake, which was in concept phase but got canceled or shelved because of the lackluster sales of the first remake. They're now working on Iron Man and Battlefield. So apparently, Dead Space Remake, despite the acclaim, commercially speaking, I don't know if didn't do well is the right term for it. It's more that it didn't meet the corporate expectations that EA had for the game. They had a certain sales target based on the budget and how much money they wanted to make off of the game, and it didn't accomplish enough to make EA and the executives and the investors happy, or at least that's what Jeff Grubb is reporting here. Now, EA actually did respond to this news, this report, which is rare for them to do, but they felt the necessity to do so in this situation because they wanted to emphasize that they were never working on a Dead Space 2 remake. According to IGN, who reached out to EA about this, EA has denied reports that a Dead Space 2 remake was in development before being canceled, and the direct quote from EA reads as follows: "We don't normally comment on rumors, but there is no validity to this story." Now, Jeff Grubb responded by saying that this is typical corporate denial. He posted, "I give you my permission to believe EA if you want, but whenever a company says that isn't true, but they don't specify which part of the story they are talking about, well, yeah, Dead Space 2 was definitely being planned. It had a code name, and they aren't making it now." Now, further clarification was provided by Jason Schreier, who did his own investigation, and according to him, based on the sources that he reached out to, people familiar with the project tell Bloomberg that EA's statement is correct, meaning that Dead Space 2 Remake was never officially in development. Jason Schreier published a whole article about this, reporting his investigation in greater detail. It reads right here that Electronic Arts has put Dead Space on ice for the second time, the first time being after Dead Space 3 flopped. The Dead Space remake seemed to indicate interest in revitalizing the series and sort of making it a marquee part of EA's portfolio moving forward. But it looks like EA has changed their mind on that front, despite the critical acclaim of Dead Space, and that has to do with lower than expected sales. It would seem as though that aspect of Jeff Grubb's report is true. Jason Schreier corroborates that sales of the remake missed the company's expectations, and so that derailed any chances of a new Dead Space game. Scrapping any kind of development for a future Dead Space game, be it a brand new entry or a Dead Space 2 remake, that was a decision that was seemingly made early last spring. So that'd be shortly, just a few months after the Dead Space remake launched, which would mean that it didn't take long after launch for EA to see that sales of Dead Space remake would not meet the financial quotas that they were expecting. And so it was a pretty quick decision to call it quit on Dead Space as a whole, for now at least. Now, there are no official sales reports on Dead Space Remake's financial performance, but you can kind of gauge numbers based on Steam all-time peak concurrent players. If you look at Dead Space Remake's all-time peak performance on Steam, you can see that that number is sitting at 28,842 players, which is about a fourth of what, say, something like Resident Evil 4 Remake accomplished, which reached an all-time peak concurrent players number of 111,172 players, according to Steam charts. And when we consider that Resident Evil 4 Remake has sold over 7 million copies as of March of 2024, perhaps it's a safe assumption to expect that Dead Space did about a fourth of that number, since its all-time peak concurrent players is a fourth of that of Resident Evil 4. And so Dead Space sales might be sitting sort of in the area of less than 2 million copies total since launch. This is a very rough estimate. These numbers are not official, but things like Steam charts are a bit of an indicator as to how well a game might be performing commercially. So assuming that Dead Space Remake sold somewhere between 1 and 2 million units, maybe on the higher end of the 1 millions, that may not be such a far-fetched assumption. Now, selling almost 2 million copies of anything is still good, but at a AAA level, at a AAA scale, we're dealing with, multi-billion-dollar companies like EA. They're looking for greater results than that. Even around launch time, we were seeing some hints that Dead Space Remake might not be selling super gangbusters. So, for example, here's an article from January 30th, 2023 that details how while Dead Space Remake did launch at #1 in UK box charts, those numbers were ultimately lower than those of Callisto Protocols. So already there were hints that Dead Space wasn't gaining the momentum that it needed for it to sell enough copies to please the EA executives to greenlight another Dead Space project. Now, apparently, while Jeff Grubb was wrong in saying that Dead Space 2 Remake was in the works before it got canceled and shelved, that doesn't mean the possibility of remaking Dead Space 2 wasn't discussed. It's just that it never made it to the table on any official capacity, as Jason Schreier details here. Yes, Dead Space is now on ice once again. EA's Motive explored ideas for a new entry early last year, but none were greenlit. The chief hope was for a new game, not a remake of Dead Space 2, despite today's rumors, although both ideas were explored. But talking about ideas and gauging what a studio might potentially want to do for their next project is one thing. It's another thing for it to be in official development, which is what Jeff Grubb was claiming, and Dead Space Remake 2 was never officially in development. It was just sort of rumblings and ideas that the developers had in mind that never ultimately panned out in any solid form. Jason Schreier further explained a potential reason for why Jeff Grubb might have confused his information, saying that Motive used the same codename to describe whatever project that the Dead Space team was working on next, hence the confusion on Jeff's part. It was never really a Dead Space 2 remake, and for nearly a year, it's had nothing to do with Dead Space. So it's not always the case that a specific codename is given to a specific project. Sometimes there's just a codename that represents any next project that might occupy the space of that codename. And so while Dead Space 2 rumblings were there behind the scenes, the thing that ultimately got the codename that Jeff Grubb confused with for an official Dead Space 2 remake development is whatever it is they're working on now that they've been working on for nearly a year. Currently, we know that Motive is working on 2 new games, the Iron Man project and a new Battlefield game. And in fact, Jason Schreier further highlighted that the leadership team that was responsible for the Dead Space remake is now focused on Battlefield, which for EA tends to be a more profitable venture. So for those who are hoping that the critical success of the Dead Space remake could pave the road to Dead Space becoming a major IP for the long-term future, I'm sorry to say that the Dead Space IP's future is not looking bright. I'm actually surprised that Dead Space didn't perform better financially because, it felt like it hit all of the right notes. Critical acclaim was there, and then it's a horror game that had a lot of good things going for it with a sci-fi motif, with a great atmosphere, and it looked like a game that would appeal to the masses, but for some reason, it didn't take off on a level that EA would have liked. I thought for sure this was going to sell like 5 million copies or something, but alas, that was not meant to be, and it is really a damn shame. EA Motive really proved that they know what they're doing with Dead Space and they can do the series justice, and for that hope to be stamped out because EA is ultimately a corporation that cares about short-term financial results rather than nurturing a series for the long term for not only the artistic merits, but also because that's how you get a series to grow over time and have a long-term loyalty and a long-term growth behind it. The inability for Suits to think about it in those terms means that we might not be seeing more Dead Space on a level that the Dead Space remake put the series out there for a long time to come. And it really sucks because the remake gave us a glimpse of what incredible games the Dead Space series paves the road for when leveraged correctly like the Motive team did. But alas, this is what it is, and hopefully whatever the Motive team moves on to next, they'll be able to stick the landing on. But I'm a little disheartened to hear that Dead Space is going to go out like this, despite the fact that it pretty much did everything right except not achieving EA numbers. Really hope that Iron Man game knocks it out of the park. They already got the flight mobility mechanics with Anthem, they can adapt some of the learnings from that game. Hopefully that game will be good enough to soften the blow that is this news, especially for fans of the series who felt like Dead Space was finally seeing the resurgence that it deserved, but alas, it was not meant to be. And that is everything you need to know about the future of Dead Space. EA has decided there is no future for the series, at least for now. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on this, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.